but it's more so in the interests of Israeli security, certainly, than it is American security. American money and resources are being depleted. It is, unfortunately, in Russia's best interest to secure that corridor. I'm not saying they should invade countries to achieve that, but just as from a neutral point of view.
Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation. The date today is July 13th, and we're going to be discussing Americans' foreign policy, with the catalyst of this discussion being, of course, Netanyahu's recent nomination of Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Some other people have done the exact same thing. And we're going to be kind of just, looking into, is this warranted? Is it not? Is there kind of a more nuanced picture there? Really what I want to dig into for this discussion is the perspective of a Trump supporter. We had last week a Democratic Socialist, so this week we're of course kind of doing the reverse there. And Connor, you've been on the podcast a few times. It's always a pleasure to discuss things with you. Your commentary is always very insightful. So, thank you so much for being with me today. And really, I just want to jump into this discussion by asking, as a Trump supporter, someone who voted for Trump, what is your, perception of Trump's overall foreign policy, and whether and to what degree it's been successful during his second term thus far? Just kind of a broad perspective on that.
I think it's, generally probably a mixed bag at best. To cut to the chase here, the MAGA base, who is, starting to turn against him now, rightfully. We voted for no more foreign wars. We voted for no more foreign entanglements. We essentially wanted to basically, wipe the slate as far as Ukraine is concerned. Severely limit or overall just cease weapons supplies to the country. The more you supply the country with arms and bombs and missiles and so forth, the longer you're prolonging this war. And now recently, just as a few days ago, Trump backtracked and he says, oh, now, we're going to really escalate arms deliveries to Ukraine and foreign aid. He did broker a ceasefire in Africa recently between Rwanda and the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So, limited success in third world there. But obviously, the glaring headline recently, as far as foreign policy is concerned, is his bombing of Iran. This is massive. This is a major shift, and I don't think it's an isolated incident. It might have simmered down for the moment, but I do think that this is something that's going to flare back up in time. We're climbing that escalation ladder slowly. It doesn't always happen. It doesn't go from 0 to 100 right away. But the rungs of the escalation ladder, you climb them gradually. And so that's a massive misstep in the eyes of the MAGA support base. Essentially. We went into Iran and we dropped, multiple 13,000-pound bunker buster bombs. That's a major violation of Iranian sovereignty from their perspective. The counter argument is that, okay, well, they were harboring potential nuclear weapons, but we know Netanyahu's this guy's a fearmonger, right? I think he leverages, the massive stranglehold that AIPAC, the Israel lobby, has on American politics. And there's been, montages of this guy over decades, talking to Congress, and, whether it's, 92, 99, 2004, all the way up to the present day, saying, oh, Iran is only 2 weeks away. It's only 4 months away. It's only 6 days away from obtaining a nuclear weapon. So I think really he's just leveraging, the lobby support over American politics to essentially, carry out Israel's dirty work. To me, this is more of an Israel first agenda than an American agenda. This, bombing Iran was not in U.S. interests. It's certainly in the best interests of Israeli national security. That's got to be. I totally understand, rightfully so. That is the top priority for for their foreign policy is dismantling Iran and their proxy networks, Hezbollah, the Houthis, etc. And Iran is the kingpin that holds all that together, and so Israel pretty much since the 1979 revolution in Iran has wanted to bring down that regime, but it's more so in the interests of Israeli security certainly than it is American security, and it's humiliating. It feels like Donald Trump has been co-opted, that he doesn't really have a say. There's that famous photo of him pulling out that chair, almost like you would for a king when Netanyahu came and he pulled out that chair and he made sure he got comfy and tucked in, and then he tucked him back into the table. You never, come on, I mean, Donald Trump, out of all people, doing something like that for somebody else, I think it really says a lot. So from a foreign policy point of view, since his inauguration in January, like I said, mixed bag at best, but very, very frustrating recently for the MAGA base.
Mhm. Got it. So let's dive into kind of a few of these points a little more fully, because it does seem to me, just kind of looking at the MAGA base right now, that there's a lot of split, right? It's not necessarily the MAGA base is sort of like revolting against Trump because of foreign policy, nor is it that they're just kind of dogmatically following whatever Trump says. It's these people are individuals; they have their own individual opinions, and there's a lot of different perspectives. There seem to me to be people like you, Connor, who are much more critical of sort of Trump's latest foreign policy or various aspects of it, whether that's Ukraine or Gaza, or the recent bombing of Iran. And then there are others who are sort of continuing to say no, these were good moves, because like we set Iran's nuclear program back or completely destroyed it. I mean, that doesn't seem to be what actually occurred based on what I'm reading, but at the very least, that's sort of a sentiment that exists. And for Gaza, of course, you can continue to make the argument that, well, it's really in not only the United States' moral interest, but sort of continued security interest to sort of do everything it can to dismantle Hamas, etc. So it seems that what I'm observing is, and I've seen a lot of commentary on this, there's a lot of different perspectives within the quote unquote MAGA crowd. It's sort of a coalition of a bunch of different groups that sort of occupy the right wing in America. So I'm just curious, like for you, based on what you're seeing, what you're reading. Obviously, this is only one vantage point, but what would you say, just in your own personal experience, with your circles, what you're seeing on social media, what you're seeing in the news, etc. What would you say that split is? You probably can't give like a percentage or anything like that, but like, what proportion of the MAGA crowd, in a kind of vague sense, would you say is really, really irked and frustrated over this recent foreign policy? And what proportion is maybe kind of following along with members of Trump's cabinet and sort of just, saying, no, this is all in line with what we promised. This is what we're doing. In fact, the bombing of Iran was, a quick military, sort of interaction to, diminish the likelihood of a more severe, sort of military engagement in the future, all that stuff. What would you say is sort of the overall perception? Like, is it your view that this is sort of an almost universal frustration among the MAGA base, or is it much more split, fractured?
No, I think it's pretty it's a pretty homogenous point of view for the most part. There is a split. You're right. There are a couple different factions within the conservative base. You have the new right, which is comprised of the younger generations, and you have the old right, which is comprised of the older generations. Specifically the baby boomers, right? So I think most people who are towing the neocon line and the pro-Israel line are the older folks, the baby boomers, because they were raised on that. They grew up in a different political landscape. It's become dogma to them, and I think it's a sacred dogma for a lot of older folks, that kind of 55 plus crowd. These people, they were, especially baby boomers are known for their evangelical beliefs, right? A lot of them make up, the the vast majority of the religious voting base in this country. And so I think that a lot of churches, most churches, evangelical churches in America, uh, essentially act as a mouthpiece for this kind of pro-Israel propaganda. I think that a lot of churches in this country have been co-opted by that sort of political narrative, and so unconditional support was something that people learned about in church. That it's not just from a political perspective, but to be a good Christian, you have to support the Jewish people. You have to support the state of Israel and Zionism. You can't be a good Christian without being a Zionist, which from a historical point of view is absolutely absurd. It's actually more so the opposite was the popular narrative for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's kind of been flipped in the last 80 years or so. But that's essentially kind of a breakdown of the split. But I do think that the emerging voice in the right wing is this younger crowd. This kind of sub 40 crowd. 30s, 20s, even teenagers who are growing up now and coming into their own political right. So those are the two different groups, and I think, well, if you spend time online, you see what your algorithm figures out that you like, and it shows you more of that. But from what I'm seeing online, I often see a lot of pro Israel posts from conservatives who are kind of on that baby boomer side and saying, oh, we had to bomb Iran, and we must unconditionally support Israel. It's in our best interest. What's good for the Jewish people is good for America, etc. And on Twitter, on X, constantly what I'm seeing is, people from the other side of the faction, the conservative faction, leaving replies saying something like, basically like you're wrong, and this is ridiculous. And they're getting ratioed. So in social media terms, on Twitter particularly, that means that, yeah, so the reply receives more retweets or more likes than the original post that it replied to. It's kind of like a humiliation, right? And so I'm constantly seeing this. So there was a pastor, evangelical pastor from Tennessee. He's like a mega church pastor, not a really old guy. He's probably like early 50s maybe. And he basically came out and he did this little monologue and saying, we have to support Israel. And somebody left a reply saying that, basically like you're full of BS. And it ratioed him like 9 or 10 times over. It was like a 10-to-1 ratio. It was really, really embarrassing. And so I think that this is kind of the emerging voices, the emerging consensus. I think it's going to reshape the conservative status quo as it's been known in recent decades.
So let's maybe dive into sort of I suppose, policy views and priorities of this, maybe kind of this younger conservative crowd. Now, of course, we never want to create the notion that there's like monoliths, I suppose, or at least, I mean, most of the time, those are kind of always false. There's going to be maybe younger conservatives who support Israel, older people who don't. But as a general rule, I think what you're saying, Connor, is exactly correct, just based on what I'm seeing as well. So let's maybe dive a little bit into, I guess, just some of like the tangible policies and solutions that this crowd would want. Now, we touched on that already, and that's sort of blank slate with respect to Ukraine. That was kind of one of the first things mentioned. So before we get to the Middle East, let's maybe talk about kind of the situation in Ukraine and what would this younger MAGA crowd have preferred in terms of a tangible policy solution. We obviously want kind of withdrawal of kind of these mass arms that are being kind of sent to Ukraine there. We don't want something that's going to prolong this conflict. So what does that look like, do you think? Just tangibly, what's sort of the vision for that? Where does that end up leaving Ukraine? Where does that leave Russia? Is that calculus of interest to the United States? Or is it just, hey, we're spending too much time on on this. We have other things to focus on. Let that resolve however it does, and that's it. Like sort of what's the vision there? What would it tangibly look like if that policy priority was pursued in a way that this younger MAGA crowd would have wanted?
Well, I think in terms of Ukraine, I think I think the general emerging consensus is that we have to let this resolve itself naturally without our input, free of our input. So, however that plays out is however it plays out. And people say, oh, well, you're abandoning Ukraine. We have a moral responsibility. In my point of view, I subscribe to realpolitik. I'm a believer in the school of thought known as realism. So much like Dr. Mearsheimer, I believe that there is no such thing as moral foreign policy. Okay, you have the interests of states. The one thing that shapes the world more so than anything else is great power dynamics, raw power dynamics. So states will always act in behalf of their own interests. Constantly seeking to, whether through the use of soft power like the United States does. People think that, that's less abrasive and that it paints the United States as a more benevolent figure, when in reality they're still interested in imperialism. We still are an imperial power. I'm not trying to make a moral judgment about that one way or another, but what I'm trying to say is that we can't sit here. It is hypocritical and disingenuous for Americans to sit here and say, oh well, we're better than Russia, because we don't. Well, we don't have to. Fortunately, we don't have to use military force all the time, but we have plenty of times, infamously, right? But we don't always have to use military force because we are the world's premier economic power, and we can use our soft power to coerce nations and manipulate them in the same way. Russia doesn't enjoy that sort of soft power. They simply don't have it. So unfortunately for them, one of the only tools that they have to affect foreign policy is the use of hard power. And that's much more abrasive when you read it on a front page in a magazine, or when you hear about it on MSNBC or Fox or whatever. But that being said, I I'm so sorry. We'll have to cut this part out. I can't remember what your question was. I
Oh
got
no,
lost
no,
there for a
totally
second.
fine.
I was going to
Um,
connect that.
yeah, yeah, no. So the original question was just like what does it tangibly look like if we pursue this policy with respect to Ukraine and Russia? Um, is it just, I think you kind of answered this, is it just like US kind of throws up its hands, let this take a natural course, whatever happens, happens, but it's in our best interest to sort of leave it there, and because of maybe the strictures of realpolitik or realpolitik, I've heard it pronounced in a variety of ways, um, we we can't sort of profess to create this like moralizing attempt to defend Ukraine, because that's just going to do more harm than good. It doesn't actually solve issues, and wherever it exists, it's usually sort of morality acting as a guise for imperial interests and that sort of thing. So the best thing at the end of the day is just to let this happen and focus maybe more on domestic affairs. Like, is that sort of the answer you were giving?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can just top that off real quick by saying that we Americans can't afford an an attritional warfare for this to continue for years and years. It is bleeding America dry, and unfortunately we have a plethora of other foreign policy, serious foreign policy entanglements, such as Taiwan. Unfortunately, I feel we are obligated to defend Taiwan in case of a Chinese incursion, because of the fact that Taiwan produces the vast majority of the world's both advanced use and less advanced use semiconductor chips, used in fighter jets and refrigerators, microwaves, etc. So that's a giant lever that they could hold over the U.S. economy if they were to take Taiwan. So unfortunately, I think we kind of have to pivot there and keep an eye on that. But more importantly, from a MAGA perspective, people just don't want to see U.S. resources being bled dry in what is essentially a proxy war. This is a proxy war by neocons, by neoconservatives, to bleed Russia dry and to damage them and hurt them as much as they can by arming Ukraine to the teeth. This is an area of the Orthodox world and the Eastern Slavic world that is considered part of the core Russian heartland. I'm not trying to say that it is or it isn't from my perspective as an American, but from the East Slavic perspective, from a historical perspective, it's almost as if, take Texas in the the broader United States as a comparison. If Texas were to split away, become an independent country for a couple decades, um, and then invite or join an anti-American Chinese sponsored military alliance. I don't think that most people would bat an eye if the Americans came in and sent troops across the border and occupied it and said, no, we're going to bring Texas back into the fold. It's in our best military interests, etc. But what we don't want is this attritional war where American money and resources are being depleted. It's like what happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan. That's what crashed that country and destroyed it. And we've already had enough foreign wars over the last 30 years.
Mhm. So a few things I want to dig into there, Connor. So I think that the Texas comparison is interesting, and I think that your point there is coming across. I do imagine that what maybe people who are I don't know, maybe a little more, what would be the term here, normative in their foreign policy approach, kind of more moralizing, like there are certain things here that we need to defend, human rights, etc. Democracy, maybe some element of the neocon perspective, or its counterpart, among progressive circles. Um, Maybe they might say, well, you would need to modify that a little bit and assume, okay, now Texas is sort of an imperfect but budding democracy, and the United States is now a dictatorship run by Putin, and now it's invading, right? I think that that's where the difference is. You can look at this and say, okay, from the perspective of someone who's just, is it? Forgive me, Connor. I've only read this term. I haven't watched a lot of lectures on it. Is it uh, realpolitik or realpolitik or
You
what's the
can say it
pronunciation?
however you like, pretty much.
Okay, I'll say realpolitik because that sounds kind of cool. Um, but from that perspective, you're like, okay, yeah, you have the situation. Texas secedes for a few decades. The United States invades. It's really not that unexpected. Let's just let this play out. This is sort of I suppose a common dynamic, between smaller secessionary powers and larger powers on their border there. Let's not waste resources on something like this. But then if you're approaching this from the kind of other perspective where you have different assumptions about foreign policy that maybe allow for a more kind of moralizing sense or moralized sense of what foreign policy should be, you might say, well, that's not the only relevant factor here. The other relevant factor is that the United States in this hypothetical is a brutal dictatorship, and Texas is it has problems with corruption, but overall it's a lot more democratic, and we need to kind of, you know, maybe do our best in a moderate sort of policy approach to promote that. Now, maybe that's not the full let's invade Iraq and establish democracy, but maybe it is let's send supplies over there and sort of help bolster that. Let's also make sure that, this is another thing that Trump's often credited for. Make sure that European powers are paying, their dues and sort of like supporting military buildup in the region. Let's make sure that they're sending a lot of stuff to Ukraine. It's not just the United States. And then, this is the other thing that I'll throw out there, maybe from this perspective that I'd like to hear kind of you respond to is that with respect to Ukraine, and Israel and these sort of foreign entanglements, they are a chunk of change, definitely. But the vast, 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 vast majority of the deficit, comes from domestic policies, things like welfare spending, et cetera. I mean, that what we're sending to Ukraine, at least to my knowledge, is fairly minute compared to all the stuff that we're spending on domestically. And I think a lot of conservatives would say a lot of that spending is wasteful and needs to be revised. So maybe it's not, maybe the sort of foreign policy isn't the biggest cost that we really need to be focused on here. And so maybe you kind of have this balancing approach where, okay, we're moralized to a degree in our foreign policy. We want to help promote democracy, but we want to do it in a much more reserved way where we're only sending supplies. We don't have troops on the ground, that sort of thing. How do you respond to something like that? I can kind of guess maybe your response is maybe you think, okay, there's a fundamental problem here. We can't treat foreign policy as moral endeavor. It is kind of those great power dynamics. It's realpolitik, and any moralizing attempts to promote democracy is just going to fail, or it's going to be a guise for imperialism, that sort of thing. One of those two. But I don't know if you just like to elaborate there on sort of what that perspective gets wrong. and whether there is feasibly a more moderated approach where we can send some money to Ukraine, but it's sort of capped and it's not bleeding the United States dry. It's not like the Soviet Union and Afghanistan where we're wasting all our resources on this. It's sort of, I guess, more balanced and more calculated. Um, what do you think that perspective gets wrong?
Well, I mean, firstly, um, certainly I think that foreign policy entanglements have, uh, created a massive deficit for this country in spending. We've gone into, absolutely historically unprecedented levels of debt spending via foreign entanglements, and Ukraine is just another one of them. Okay, so far maybe we haven't spent as much on it as we did in Afghanistan or Iraq, or in the Gulf, or wherever it was.
Mm,
But nonetheless, it's just adding, it's a cumulative effect. It's just, oh, this war is, we're not spending that much on it. What's one more? What's one
mhm,
more foreign policy entanglement? Um, but really, I see the world as divided into spheres of influence. So it's like the Monroe Doctrine, and this is something that it's probably my favorite lecture from Dr. Mearsheimer,
mhm,
where he talks about well, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a good precedent where the Soviets came in and they established influence in Cuba. Of course, they were our mortal enemy at the time, and we found that absolutely unacceptable. That was a red line to be crossed. You're not going to station missiles or have Cuba be part of an anti-American military alliance right on our border. So I'm not trying to pass a moral judgment on the Russia Ukraine war in one way or another, but just historically from a historical point of view, Russia has been invaded a multitude of times through the what's called the Northern European Plain. Napoleon, it's flat. It's all the way from France in the west, and it stretches all the way to Moscow. You can just march troops and tanks. Napoleon did it, and then Hitler did it. And those are just the two most notable examples in recent history. So it's no surprise that it is unfortunately in Russia's best interest to secure that corridor. I'm not saying they should invade countries to achieve that, but just as from a neutral point of view, just looking at realpolitik and realism, it's kind of predictable that a great power with that sort of weakness is going to act to secure that weakness, even if it's at the expense, unfortunately, of smaller neighboring states. What the United States should do about that is a question for another day. But I'm just trying to provide some context there. But um, essentially, um, I'm so sorry, Sam. I did not sleep well last night. I'm just
Oh,
blanking out. I was up till
you are
four.
totally
I
good.
didn't fall asleep until 4:30 in the morning. I'm running on fumes right now. I
You're
keep going
totally
off
good.
on
No,
tangents because I want them to something, and then my
yeah,
brain just shuts down.
no, I've been there. I can tell you that. No, I mean, and I think that's absolutely fine. We aren't really looking in this podcast for like kind of just the definitive expert answer to this question. It's really just me trying to understand the perspective of kind of this younger MAGA crowd on foreign policy, as of late. And yeah, just kind of digging into that a little bit. So no, you're totally fine, Connor.
I wanted to like answer your question though, because I feel like I was like giving a little bit of context, and then I didn't even get around to like answering your question. So, um,
Yeah,
what were
no,
you
you're good.
saying? Because I want to actually answer your question. I'll be more
Yeah,
concise.
yeah. So just to kind of repeat the question there, um, I think that one could have something that's kind of a middle ground in this foreign policy, right? It's a middle ground between the neocons and maybe kind of the cosmopolitan, like human rights crowd on the left, and then a middle ground between that and say the sort of isolationists and or let's just focus on domestic issues, maybe not full on isolationism, but at least let's remove ourselves from foreign entanglements, especially military ones, and really focus on trying to reduce the deficit, that sort of thing. I think between those perspectives, maybe you could have, and this is not realpolitik, but maybe you could have like an approach where, okay, no, we value promoting democracy and promoting human rights, That is something that we value. That is sort of a moral ideal, but we need to do it in a very, very cautious way, and a way that doesn't, entail, say, sending troops to Iraq to establish a democracy, or like basically just everything that we've done in the Middle East, right? Not that. Um, and so maybe one could say, well, let's send money and arms to Ukraine because they are a democracy. Maybe they're a corrupt one, or maybe they've had problems with corruption. But at the very least, it's probably better, if you value democracy, to live under, Ukraine than it is to live under Putin's regime in Russia. Um, so let's send arms, let's send some money, but let's keep it capped. Let's sort of identify this is how much we can reasonably spend on this, given the degree to which we value democracy promotion. Um, and let's kind of cap things there. Let's make sure European powers are doing their part. It seems to me, based on what I'm aware of, that they are. And let's then just turn everything else to domestic matters, right? Let's not let this spiral into some super expensive foreign entanglement. Let's just have a moderate policy of democracy promotion where it is realistic, it's feasible, then until sending some money and arms to Ukraine, but it's sort of capped there. Now, that seems to me to be kind of like a middle ground between these two kind of more extreme approaches. So what I'm curious about, Connor, is what do you think that sort of more moderate perspective gets wrong, and why no, we should not even that, just cut off all support to Ukraine and let it kind of naturally play out. Anything else is just kind of wasting money. I was just curious if you could elaborate on that more.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to be more directly to the point this time, I think that the art of statecraft is incredibly complex. It's nuanced, right? You have many different regions of the world occupied by different peoples who subscribe to different ways of life and different religions. And democracy isn't a one size fits all. I think that's something that's become evident over the decades. Even if you trace back to the beginning of the post-war period in 1945, uh, a lot of people like to talk about the U.S. as being the gatekeeper and the guardian of democracy and the exporter of democracy and freedom and human rights and all these newer terms that have emerged in recent decades. But the one caveat that's important to look at here is the historical precedent, America's actual track record in exporting democracy. I really don't think that America is that interested in exporting democracy as their number one priority. I think that's something that they sell to the general public because, of course, you have to, in a democracy, especially if that's your chosen form of government, you have to have public support on your side to carry out political itineraries, right? And so I think that it is something that, in large part, the liberal American public, which is especially in academia and the circles in and around policy conversations, are incredibly liberal. So I think that's something that is overwhelmingly wished for in the public's eyes in that sense. But when you look at the U.S.'s historical track record on this stuff, it's definitely less than desirable. We don't always support democracies. We support autocracies, dictatorships. We've supported and propped up excuse me. We have supported and propped up totalitarian regimes. I mean, Chile,
Yep.
Central and South America, because it was this just ties back into realism and realpolitik, but because it was in our best interest of exporting global American hegemony and American influence around the globe. So, I think at the end of the day that the U.S. supports whichever regime helps maintain and cement their influence in whatever corner of the globe they happen to be meddling in. And if it happens to be a democracy, then so be it. If it's a democracy, if it's a democratically elected government, like ones in previous decades in Central and South America, that say no, we want to kick American fruit companies out of wherever it is, Nicaragua, or we're going to nationalize these these industries for on behalf of the people, then okay, then democracy is a bad thing, right? Um, and then all of a sudden, the U.S. intelligence community goes in and they ensure that this person is removed from power and replaced with somebody, whatever, a liberal democracy or just an outright dictatorship in a lot of
Hmm.
cases. The track record is poor and it's hypocritical.
Yeah. No, that is absolutely correct. That's happened on a number of occasions. Um, what I want to do, Connor, I was going to shift focus and just talk about current events in the Middle East, but I think because that receives like an inordinate amount of commentary already, what I think I want to do for the rest of this podcast, with just like the, I don't know, 10 minutes or so we have remaining, is just focus on realpolitik and kind of digging into that. I'm kind of more interested in that, at least just for the purpose of this podcast. Again, because the two of us aren't going to solve the crises in the Middle East. I just want to kind of address like um, sort of the tenets behind this view, because I think you're right in that this does it does underlie a whole heck of a lot in terms of foreign policy debate, and whether the United States should be or shouldn't be doing what it's doing in Ukraine, doing what it's doing in Gaza, doing what it did with Iran, doing what it's doing in sort of the Indo-Pacific. Uh, there's just a whole heck of a lot that seems dependent on whether you bring sort of this moralized promotion of democracy and human rights into the foreign policy, or whether you focus entirely on just sort of the power dynamics, the economic benefits and transactions, the spheres of influence, and place maybe more emphasis on national sovereignty and that sort of thing, right? So let's just dive into, I think, realpolitik and what your views are on it. I'm going to contest some of those, and let's just see where we end up. So there's one question I have based on how you've presented realpolitik so far. Well, first of all, before I ask this, are you okay with that direction for the podcast?
Yeah, no, that sounds good.
Okay, awesome. So it seems to me like there's kind of two ways to frame realpolitik, and they're interconnected. I would say one is a descriptive version of realpolitik, the other is a normative or sort of moral version of it. Now, the descriptive one, which I've seen in your comments a little bit, is just states act in their best interests. That's just what they do. And because of that, trying to promote, democracy and human rights, especially through military intervention and or support, it doesn't end up working, right? Because states aren't acting in this moral fashion. They always revert back to their self-interest. And so this promotion of democracy, it's maybe hypocritical or just ineffective because it doesn't grapple with what states are actually doing. Um, so that's the descriptive version, right? States just act in their best interests, their security interests, their economic interests. We can frame that interest in a number of ways, but maybe the best way to describe it is just the promotion of their geostrategic power or something like that, right? Um, and then the second sort of way to frame realpolitik is that states should not act in a way that act in any way except what is in their best interest, right? So one tenet is this is what states just do. The other is this is what states should do. They should act in their geostrategic interests. They should sort of act in a way that expects other states to do the same. And so that means that states should not try to promote democracy and human rights unless somehow that's really just acts in their best interest as a state, right? The promotion of their power. I'm curious, what would you how would you frame realpolitik between the descriptive and the normative? Would you say it's sort of both of those things at once? Because as I see it, we can say that states are always going to act in their self-interest, but I mean, it seems to me that if a lot of the criticisms you're offering are true, the United States hasn't really done that. We're not doing that with Israel at the very least, right? Maybe we're acting irrationally there, and we're being driven by morality and or the influence of a lobby. And thus maybe that first tenet of realpolitik isn't actually true. It's not true that states always act in their self-interest. They can be, deluded or act in other interests that are irrational, right? And so that seems to present realpolitik as more of that moral stuff, right? We should not do something that is not in the United States' best interest and do that for the sake of promoting democracy and human rights. Um, so again, I'm kind of talking myself in circles now, and I apologize for that. But I just want to ask, like, do you think that realpolitik is more of a descriptive thing or more of a normative thing about what states are obligated to do.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, the only, I think one of the core tenets of realpolitik is that it rejects, most of the moralizing in politics. The one moral tenet that you can bring to realpolitik, if at all, is the fact that I guess, you could say that states are obligated first and foremost to protect the collective good, to protect the best interests of, this is the key word here, citizenry, the citizenry of that nation state. And so, however, that outcome is best achieved in through the lens of realpolitik is therefore the best course of action. Um, and that can take many different forms, but yeah, I mean that's what I'd say if you want to talk about a moralizing force in realpolitik, if at all.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. So got it. So let me just kind of get this, make sure I understand this correctly. So there's one basic moral principle in realpolitik, and that is states act in the collective good of their citizenry. And sort of in light of that, you kind of get this, I guess. Or hold on, I'm thinking out loud here, so I
It
apologize
could
if
be a
things are a
hybrid
little
approach.
muddled.
Sometimes it could be elements of democracy. I was listening to a rabbi talk about the state of Israel, and he took a very I just noticed that he took a very realpolitik stance to it, and he said, well, what's more important for Israel,
Mhm,
um, Judaism or democracy? And he
mhm,
said, "Oh, Judaism by far." He said, "Absolutely, there's no contest." He said, there are some good things about democracy for sure that are beneficial to Israel, but we're not. Israel is not like a pure, full-fledged democracy. It's a mix and match approach, right? It's whatever is in the best interest of the Jewish people. And if that's a hybrid democracy, if that's a hybrid system like an illiberal democracy, something that you see in maybe Hungary and with Viktor Orban or other places like that, then that is the best course of action for Israel because the whole idea links back to the nation state and the people and whatever outcome whatever course of action achieves the best outcome for the state and its citizens is therefore the best course of action. It directly contravenes with this idea when you hold true to a moral dogma or a political
mhm,
dogma that has to be adhered to at all times in foreign policy or domestic policy,
mhm.
regardless of the outcome that it has.
Yeah. So I'm going to be a little annoying here, and I'm going to do sort of the standard practice in maybe contemporary ethics, and that's just like, okay, we have a moral principle, and if we claim this moral principle sort of underlies everything that we or say an actor in a situation, say a state, should do, let's take it to the extreme and see if it starts to break down. If it does break down, then maybe we can start to establish some boundaries and say that things are a little more nuanced. So I'm going to try to do that here, and just let me know what you think of this. So um, one of my worries is that, just kind of what you said there, that, um, realpolitik it's sort of against the use of sort of a moralized dogma in foreign policy. And yet I worry that it itself could become a dogma potentially and could lead to some maybe pretty unfortunate circumstances. Let me give an example. This is not realistic. This is a thought experiment, right? So this is not going to happen, but let's just consider it and then consider its implications. Let's say that I don't know, like there are let's just say we're in a situation where the United States government can choose between two things. Either it can sacrifice one of its citizens, right? Or it can let, I don't know, like 5 million people of other countries die, right? Now, again, this isn't a realistic situation. Maybe there's aliens coming down or saying, okay, United States government, you have these two choices, right? Choose one there. Now, if we take realpolitik like as sort of a dogma, then it seems to me that the correct answer for the United States government would, under realpolitik, be no, we're going to save our citizen, right? Because our obligation is first and foremost to our citizenry, right? So save the one person, 5 million people die. Whereas I think a lot of people might look at that and say, well, maybe in this sort of absurd and crazy hypothetical, if something like that ever did happen, maybe we would take kind of a more nuanced approach and say, okay, well, no, let's talk about this a little more. I think the calculus looks different in this really extenuating circumstance. Now, if we take that approach, then the reason that that's useful as a thought experiment is because it establishes limits on sort of realpolitik and says, okay, the vast majority of the time, the government ought to act in the best interest of its citizenry. However, we've now established that maybe in some truly crazy circumstances, that might not apply. And now a debate opens up, and we can start to analyze, okay, has the circumstance reached some sort of threshold, or does it have qualities that are unique enough to sort of override that government's sort of moral principle of doing what's in the best interest of its citizenry? And now there's another moral principle that's superseding that, right? So that's sort of the usefulness of this thought experiment, because it can establish that there are certain moral principles that in certain circumstances might override the government's obligation to the welfare of its citizenry. So what I would ask is, do you think that such circumstances can potentially exist? Or do you think that no, realpolitik, it's the one moral principle that applies to states and they need to act in the best interest of their citizenry always? Now, maybe the individual does something differently, but for a state, always the best interest of its citizenry, bar none, that is the moral obligation. I'm just curious as to whether you think there's room for overriding that principle potentially, and whether that opens up debate about foreign policy that might sometimes violate realpolitik. Oh, I can't hear you, Connor. I think you're muted.
I actually don't think that it would play out that way. One citizen versus, the lives of 5,000 foreigners. That's actually the one principle that underscores realpolitik more so than anything else. Is essentially it's just a fancy word for political pragmatism, for
Mm,
utilitarianism. So
mm,
it depends on the political stakes. Realpolitik and realism, by extension, is really about balancing domestic harmony, social order, the collective interests of the nation state, and by extension,
mm,
the citizenry with, um, you know, for foreign policy engagements within realism, they tend to be much more selective,
mm,
and also balancing power, right? And so it's in the hands of the ruling class, or whoever happens to be in government at the time, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, or some other party in some other country. It's about the ultimate form of political utilitarianism and pragmatism. So actually, I don't view. I think realpolitik is stands strongly against dogma. Actually,
mm,
maybe what I was describing. It's probably more helpful to caveat by saying this. What I was describing earlier is more so realpolitik with more of a nationalist tint to it.
okay.
Okay, so that's my one caveat there is that that what you were
Mm,
describing, I don't ever see realpolitik as a school of thought or realism as a school of thought. Um, choosing the citizen in that case,
mm,
because it all depends on the political stakes of that decision and whether or not
yeah.
it. I don't know if that decision throws the balance of power between great powers off, and if it greatly endangers the social harmony and collective economic and social security of the nation state, then okay, then it's there's the pragmatism coming in. Then we'll reassess
Mm,
and figure out whatever is the best option to maintain the very delicate balance of power. That's something that Otto von Bismarck, who is the father of realpolitik,
mhm.
uh, you know, he employed to great success in Prussia when he unified all the different German-speaking states into a coherent nation state.
Mm. Well, thank you for that, Connor. That helps clarify my notion of realpolitik quite a bit more. It's not about the this sort of mechanical application of a dogma. Whatever's in the best interest of our citizenry, that's what we're going to do. But it's more of like a more complex analysis of, well, maybe what's in the best interest of our citizenry is sort of, I guess let me frame it this way. Realpolitik does entail the promotion of the best interest of the citizenry. That is the ultimate obligation of the state. But that best interest isn't just obvious in such a way that can be mechanically applied in every circumstance. It's more nuanced than that. Like maybe killing the 5 million people, or letting the aliens do that or whatever. It's going to create repercussions that then damage the U.S. citizenry. Something like that. So you allow for that more nuanced, pragmatic approach, but it's still sort of tethered to this obligation of sort of states acting in the best interest of their citizenry, and that creates the best overall maybe sort of international space, right? Creates the most order, most predictability, something like that. Like, would you take that next step and say that states acting in their best interest in this way and the collective good of their citizenry, it creates a better overall international space, something that's more conducive to the welfare of people across the globe? Or would you not quite take that further step and say, well, that's kind of maybe less clear?
Well, I think it's about, I say this because oftentimes, from a historical perspective, realism and realpolitik is often fused with, conservative forms of government that prioritize the national interest. So sometimes it's kind of hard for me to separate realpolitik as a school of thought from, the real world examples, which often feature a sort of overarching, first and foremost, a national interest, a national itinerary,
Yeah.
and a nation state for the people. But I think, at its core, it is very anti dogma, realpolitik. So yes, it is important to act in the collective good of the nation state and its citizenry. Here's the caveat: when feasible, when
Mm,
politically feasible.
mhm,
So I guess really it's a good example would be, somebody like Otto von Bismarck, realpolitik, realism statesman, would
mhm,
likely, decry the US's tone and decision making when it comes to foreign policy. They would say he would look back on our track record and say, you on behalf of this moral dogma, on behalf of human rights and civil liberties and in the name of democracy, you go on these crusades and you kill hundreds of thousands and you bring ruin to states, and you have no political flexibility. um, it's yeah, I think he would find it perhaps laughable.
mm, mm. Got it. So let me frame it this way then. The fundamental basis, the guiding principle, the closest thing to a dogma the realpolitik would have is not do whatever's in the collective good for the collective interest of the citizenry, but it's sort of like maybe the kind of more amorphous and practical virtue of prudence, right? And use this guiding principle, this really strong rule of thumb, maybe do what's in the best interest of the collective good of your citizenry, as sort of the starting point, like the I guess prima facie. Here's what you're going to do, kind of unless there's really extenuating circumstances. That sort of tint, as you said, but overall, it's not something that can be formulated as sort of like a set of like rules that you mechanically apply, a formula that pre-exists the circumstances in which you engage with other states as a policymaker, right? You have to get in there, you have to find what is the most practical, what's the most feasible, what's the most prudent, and have as your hope, your ideal, your guiding principle, the collective interest of your citizenry. And then maybe like further moral guiding principles, like, do what's in the best interest of people as a whole, but those are moderated and sort of supplanted by the principle of prudence here, of pragmatism. Um, yeah, I don't know. Would you say that's kind of an accurate image of realpolitik? That's combined with this descriptive observation that states are almost always, if not always, going to do what's in their best interest, and pretend otherwise is hypocritical.
Yeah, I mean, I think you pretty much nailed it when you said that it's not a formula. that you follow to the T, because it's not. It's just it's a kind of an emanation. It's an abstract idea. It's like you said. It's kind of amorphous. It's fluid. It becomes it employs and encourages pragmatism and utilitarianism, like I said earlier. So I guess to cap it off here, one of the best examples that I can think of in the last 30 years to really illustrate this idea of what's in the best collective interests of the nation state from a realpolitik perspective, and and what's dogma that actually harms the public interests. I think the Gulf War actually is in 1992 is a great example of when under a realism and realpolitik where you know uh, the use of hard power in conflict can be justified as being in the interests of the state and the people. Saddam at the time, he had the world's, I think it was the world's third largest army. A lot of people, younger people from our generation, don't really understand what Iraq was like before it, we turned it into a mess over the last, 30 years. But it used to be a very coherent country. It wasn't this, uh, this mess of factionalism and warring tribes. It used to be coherent. It used to be fairly wealthy and very well organized with a very large military. So essentially, you have this guy Saddam Hussein who wanted to decided he wanted to have a monopoly on the Middle East oil supply, and in a nutshell, that's against the interests of the American people, because obviously, having this anti-American autocrat, controlling the a large portion of the world's oil supply is going to have massive negative knock-on effects for the American economy. It's going to harm the average American consumer, etc. So in that case, you could say that war was justified. However, on the flip side, bombing Iran on behalf of Israel, I mean, really, Iran poses no, from my point of view, I really think has just been a country. It's been so hollowed out by sanctions. It's been so crippled, through the use of American soft power, which I think has been very effective over the last 40 years. Their military is stuck in the 1970s. They're just such a weak country. They don't pose any immediate threat to America, to Israel, perhaps. But this is just another example of where dogma comes in. Or you could say it about the war in Iraq, in 2003, weapons of mass destruction. There were none, right? This was an unjustified crusade. We told the American public that, we're going in because of human rights. We're going in because democracy, because these countries need democracy, and we have a moral obligation to spread it to them. That's where realpolitik would come in and say, hey, you're getting dangerously dogmatic with your politics, and it's leading to unjustified wars, violence, and it's becoming a drain on the state. Most importantly, I think that's probably the crux of the issue from a realpolitik perspective, is that more so than rather just pointing out this false moral posturing. It's more about the drain on the state, which is problematic because it's not in the best interests of the public and the nation state.
Mm, mm. Well, thank you so much, Connor. I mean, we're about out of time, but I think, I try to stay away from like super kind of academic and abstract discussions, but here I think that this was useful because this allows me to better understand kind of where a portion of the conservative crowds, maybe a lot of younger MAGA supporters are coming from, and even while they may not all like use academic jargon and sort of have realpolitik as like a clearly formulated guiding principle. At the very least, I think we're seeing a lot of these basic principles play out in American politics today. I mean, you have a lot of MAGA supporters very much just saying, hey, let's not waste our resources on these foreign entanglements that don't have a clear connection to how Americans are living their lives, today. And we're probably doing more harm and prolonging conflicts, outside of the U.S. because of what we're doing here. And this, what you've just presented, Connor, it helps me have a clearer understanding of sort of what's underlying that perspective beyond just the noise of everyday politics. There's something more I guess, for lack of a better term, just more robust, kind of underlying this perspective. So I just thank you for kind of presenting it. I'd love to discuss it more in the future. Love to get people with alternative perspectives in the room so we can dive into some of this. But at the very least, thank you for kind of the value you've provided me in delineating that perspective more.
Yeah, thanks for challenging some of this stuff. I think it's been a productive conversation. Civil dialogue is what it's about at the end of the day. Understanding each other. It's the most important thing.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Connor. And thank you so much, everyone, for watching. If you enjoyed this podcast, leave a like, comment, etc. Let us know. What did you think about the discussion? What do you think about these topics? If there's anything you think we can improve on, feedback is always welcome. And yeah, we'll see you all next week.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.